Hello, and welcome to Didn't Read It's Holiday Horror Theater. Just like last year, I'm recording a few ghostly tales to keep you company through the new year. These stories are presented in full and with minimal commentary. I'm giving myself and my guests a bit of a research break. This story, in particular, is a straightforward, classic ghost story. A Christmas party takes a sudden turn when a very particular ghost makes an appearance during a seance. Written by Margery Lawrence and first published in 1935, I present to you, for your holiday listening pleasure, The Man Who Came Back. It was a very merry house party. The givers of it, Colonel and Lady Garrison, were two pleasant, gregarious souls. Not particularly interesting in themselves, but possessing that priceless gift that, in my opinion, should be subsidized, when found, by the government of the country to which the owner of it belongs. That gift that the Americans crisply describe as mixing. The Garrisons, childless, well-to-do, and middle-aged, gave, it was well known, by far the most amusing parties in their particular coterie. And fierce was the competition for invitations, especially to the annual Christmas house party, held in their country home, a rambling, old-fashioned, but supremely comfortable old manor in a well-known hunting county. The colonel was a keen man to hounds, and despite his increasing years, still easily held his own with the younger men. And several of his rivals in the hunting field were members of the present party, who, sitting around a blazing fire in the drawing room after dinner, were eating chestnuts and cracking jokes, well pleased with themselves, their dinner, and their hosts. Ted Boulter, the MFH, and his pretty little wife, whose Dresden china beauty belied her pluck on horseback. The two Simons, brother and sister. Londoners, dark, given to odd clothes and odder bohemian jargon. Altogether too arty and crafty, in the colonel's private opinion. But indubitably young people to know, since they were rapidly becoming the only people who counted in the matter of smart house decoration. The Todhunters, travelers and explorers. Cecily Fleet, a county beauty, just embarking on a film career, and her two admirers, Len Ponsonby and Terry Walters. A couple of young nephews, all bouncin' brawn, and two new acquaintances that Lady Garrison had picked up at the bridge club she frequented in town. Dr. and Mrs. Playfair. Charming people, thought the colonel, as, with his glasses perched precariously on his forehead, and his dinner jacket rumpled as usual between his shoulders, he twiddled with the knobs on his beloved radio, in a vain endeavor to get Rome or Milan. Charming people. Playfair himself was a brilliant young fellow, one of the coming men in Harley Street, everybody said, and his wife was a damn pretty woman, small and slim and exquisitely dressed, with hair the color of a new chestnut and golden hazel eyes. The two were complete lovebirds. At least, Playfair was obviously madly in love with his wife. Never let her out of his sight unless he could help it, while she seemed sincerely fond of him. But between love and mere fondness lies a world of difference. Still, it seemed to be working all right, thought the colonel to himself, as he struggled with the wireless. But neither Rome nor Milan responded, and, defeated, he turned to his guests. Something wrong with the blasted thing. Not that it matters. Anybody care for a game of billiards? He demanded. A chorus of assent came from the younger men, but Lady Garrison's motherly voice rose above them. Not a bit of it. I'm not going to let one of you out of here yet. I've got a surprise. Not another ghost, demanded Cecily Fleet, who had been at last year's gathering and still retained vivid memories of the amazingly well-staged ghost scare that Lady Garrison had got up for the amusement of her Christmas guests. Lady Garrison, plump and matronly in plum-colored satin, shook her well-marcelled gray head. Nothing so ordinary. She looked round the expectant circle with a smile of satisfaction. I've got another stunt, as you young people call it. What do you think? I've persuaded Madame Esperanza, the famous medium, to come and give us a sitting. There was a general chorus of acclaim. How splendid! How perfectly marvelous! The Bolters, who had a passion for bridge and considered any evening not spent at cards an evening wasted, smiled with tempered enthusiasm and said nothing. Cecily Fleet pressed her fingers, long and slender and tipped with shining scarlet nails, to her correspondingly scarlet lips, and rolled her scared blue eyes over them at the company in general. I shall be simply terrified, she proclaimed. But from his post at one side of the fire, Ned Playfair responded, smiling indulgently. No need to be in the least alarmed, Miss Fleet. His rich, pleasant voice was comfortingly reassuring. It's only an amusing game, of course. I assure you, there's nothing whatever in these so-called mediums. Nothing supernatural, that is. What do you mean by nothing whatever? Lady Garrison's tone was faintly nettled. With a bend of his handsome head in her direction, the young doctor deprecatingly replied, Please forgive me, Lady Garrison. But really, you see, as a doctor, we know what this kind of thing is worth. And surely you, of all people, only regard a thing like this sitting, seance, whatever one likes to call it, as an amusing sort of game. You don't think there's really anything in it. There was a pause. Lady Garrison's plump face was faintly flushed, and her lips were pressed together. She was sharply irritated, in truth. Not that she herself was an ardent believer in spiritualism, in which, to be honest, she was merely a dabbler. But Playfair's undisguised contempt stung her. I don't know. She spoke defiantly. I'm not clever enough to argue the point, Dr. Playfair. And I freely admit that I, personally, haven't done enough of it to be able to speak with any authority. But if people like Marshall Hall and Oliver Lodge and Conan Doyle and so on find something worth considering in it, it surely can't be dismissed so easily as that. There was an awkward pause. Cecily Fleet broke it with a little gush of girlish earnestness. I'm sure the doctor didn't mean that, she said, skillfully skimming over what precisely she meant by that. But I'm sure the rest of us want to see Madam What's-Her-Name most frightfully. I do, for one. We do, chorused the Simons eagerly. And a general murmur of enthusiasm arose. It was obvious that the doctor's attitude of antagonism was not popular, and he was clever enough to see the wisdom of retreating, at least a little way. He had no desire to quarrel with the Garrisons and their very well-to-do circle. I'm sure I apologize, Lady Garrison, if I inadvertently said anything you might have construed into a sneer or a slight on your surprise. He smiled again at the old lady where she sat stiffly braced, upright in her favorite red satin Victorian chair, and against her will she thawed, smiling reluctantly back. Certainly Playfair knew how to handle women, reflected the colonel, amused. Repute had it that he had plenty of experience with them. Even that his large practice was due to his extraordinary influence over, and charm for, women. But that was gossip, in all probability. Mere jealousy directed against a rising man. and the colonel, who was strictly fair-minded, scouted the idea almost as soon as it raised its head. Yet it would not be entirely banished. Like a sardonic imp, it sat there, in the remotest corner of his mind, listening and watching as the young doctor smoothed down the ruffled feelings of his hostess and re-established himself in her good graces. "You know I didn't mean to be at all rude, Lady Garrison. Far from it. I spoke on impulse, that's all, and I had no idea you took the thing so seriously. But since you do, why then, I withdraw. Of course, I shall be only too pleased to join in anything you like to arrange." Lady Garrison arose, appeased. "That's all right," she said. "I'll go and fetch Madame Esperanza. She's here already, resting and preparing in my room." Mrs. Bolter gave a little squeak of delighted fear. "Oh, is she here? Have you kept her hidden until this moment? Oh, Ted, how thrilling!" "I only hope," said Lady Garrison, "that the sitting will be thrilling. But mind, I don't promise anything. She said herself that unless the conditions were favorable, she couldn't guarantee anything at all." "The usual guff," muttered Ned Playfair to his wife. Ida Playfair glanced up at her husband curiously, her hazel eyes starry under the shadow of her fringe of chestnut hair. "Don't you like it, Ned? If you'd rather not sit, I'm sure we can get out of it. I'm a little scared, to be honest." He shook his head and glanced round the rest of the group, their eyes fixed expectantly on the door. "I'm afraid not. I've rather foolishly put the old girls back up by joking about it. And since I want to get them as patients, or at least some of their friends, they've a hell of a lot of influence. I suppose we shall have to sit through it. But you've no reason to feel scared, Ida. It's all rot. Clever posing, with a spot of telepathy or hypnotism or guesswork thrown in as make-weight." He smiled down at her reassuringly, but her eyes were on the fire. Her expression was faintly dissatisfied. "I don't know," she began. "If, as Lady Garrison says, all these brilliant men have come to the conclusion that there is something in it, surely it can't be all rubbish. And Tilly Van Hayden told me—" Impatiently, he interrupted, his black brows drawn together in a dangerous-looking scowl. "I don't care what Tilly Van Hayden said. She's a silly, twittering fool, anyway. Just the type that likes to mess about with what it describes as the occult. I tell you it's fraud. And when it's not deliberate fraud, it's a mixture of hysteria and self-delusion and hypnotism. And I don't know what. If it weren't for the fact that I can't afford to offend the old folks, we've only just got to know them, I'd go upstairs to bed right away and not waste time on their damn silly seance. But—" He paused, for the door opened, and Lady Garrison entered, followed by a strange woman. An insignificant little woman, wearing a shabby black velvet dress, ornamented with a conglomeration of cheap beads around her neck. She had graying hair, untidily bundled into a bun at the back of her head, and a small, faded, indefinite face behind large, horn-rimmed glasses. An almost audible hush of disappointment ran around the room, for nobody less like a professional Sybil could possibly be imagined. But Lady Garrison, experienced hostess, instantly filled in the awkward moment with a flood of introductions. Madame Esperanza, Mrs. Bolter, Miss Fleet, Mr. and Mrs. Todhunter. The little woman, warming her meager hands at the fire, nodded and smiled vaguely at each fresh name, until Lady Garrison ended her litany with, "Dr. and Mrs. Playfair, and that's the lot." The medium, raising her eyes from the fire, surveyed the owners of the last two names, He still standing with one arm on the mantelpiece, watching the proceedings with a quizzical eye. She crouched on a black velvet pouf at his feet, her white frock billowing about her like a summer cloud. For a moment, Madame Esperanza eyed the pretty woman at her feet, then spoke suddenly. "Are you going to be at the sitting?" she asked. Her voice was reedy, and she spoke with a faintly uneducated twang. Ida Playfair regarded her with a slight sense of distaste, mingled with wonder and a rising sense of incredulity. Surely nothing that this common, shabby little woman could say could really be worthwhile. Probably, as Ned declared, she was just a clever poser, some backstreet pythoness who had somehow managed to impress dear old Theodosia Garrison, but quite obviously nobody to feel afraid of. She laughed breezily. "Certainly I am. I'm not going to miss shaking hands with a ghost." The medium looked down at her in silence. Behind, the room was in a cheerful uproar, as chairs were hastily arranged in a circle, tables, cushions, and whatnots pushed into corners, the door locked, and a length of scarlet silk draped over the chandelier to dim its brightness to the requisite subdued glow. Lady Garrison, in her element, was bustling about, directing operations, and for a moment the three beside the fire were alone, unnoticed, the shabby little woman with the intent eyes, and the handsome young doctor and his wife. As if hypnotized by that strange, steady stare, for a moment Ida stared back without speaking, and then Madame Esperanza spoke, suddenly and decidedly. "I wouldn't if I were you," she said. Ida's eyes flew wide with amazement, and her husband laughed dryly. "Why not?" he said, curtly. The medium looked at him, opened her mouth to speak, and changed her mind, looking back at the fire and warming her hands in silence. But Ida Playfair's curiosity was aroused. Moreover, she felt faintly irritated that the woman's warning should coincide with a deep-seated sense of reluctance in her own heart. She did not want to take part in the sitting, in truth, but it was odd that Madame What's-Her-Name should have echoed that feeling. "Why don't you think I should go to the sitting?" she persisted. The medium lifted her thin shoulders in an oddly foreign shrug. Perhaps, reflected the doctor sardonically, she actually deserved the name under which she worked. Esperanza. It was a convincing name with which to tickle the groundlings, and she was quite a good actress anyway. All this, of course, was according to type. She wouldn't be able to say why she had said that to Ida. She would only hedge and hint. Yet, "I can't tell you why I said that," the medium said, almost brusquely. "But sometimes before a sitting I get the feeling that for a certain person it would be better if they didn't join in. I don't know why, but it's always right." She raised her eyes, suddenly piercing behind their horn-rimmed glasses, to Playfair, standing leaning against the mantelpiece with his hands in his pockets, a barely concealed smile of derision on his dark face. "It applies to you too, you know," she said bluntly. "I'd keep away from this sitting if I were you." Playfair's mouth fell open. Then he laughed, aloud and scornfully. "My dear lady, what on earth have I to fear?" Again that dark glance, and again the shrug. "You know best. I don't know a thing about your life, of course. But if you've a secret, if you've something to hide, or if you've done something, well, that you don't like to look back on, then if so, I'd find some excuse not to join the circle. Ida Playfair's hand flew to clasp her husband's. Something to hide? Her voice was sharp with affectionate resentment. What a perfectly idiotic idea! Darling. But for once, an appeal by his adored wife passed Ned Playfair by. He did not hear, for he was staring at the woman with sudden attention. Staring fixedly, and for a moment it seemed as though his handsome face was a trifle white and strained. Then, with a brusque laugh, he seemed to dismiss the whole thing and turned away. Absurd! But I congratulate you. He spoke coldly over his shoulder. I congratulate you on playing the part excellently. From the first minute you came on the stage. Brilliant, really. You ought to go on the stage proper. The taunt was blatantly rude, but the medium did not seem to hear. She was staring down into the fire, apparently lost in thought. Flushed with excitement, Lady Garrison bustled up, talking as usual at the top of her voice. Come on now, come along. It's all ready. That's right, isn't it, madam? The medium turned, and surveying the room, nodded briefly. You have the door locked so that servants can't come in and interrupt? Good. Then we'll start. Entering the circle, she seated herself in the central chair, the huge leather grandfather, generally sacred to the colonel, and glanced around the ring of eager faces that surrounded her. Taking off her glasses, she put them neatly away, like any maiden aunt, in a leather spectacle case, and tucked them into the beaded bag that swung from her waist. And for a moment, Ida Playfair blinked, surprised. For the eyes that the horn-rimmed glasses had hidden were dark and amazing, set in deep hollows that emphasized their darkness. Piercing, oddly dominant eyes. Eyes that, suddenly, seemed to promise all sorts of possibilities. A faint sense of fear touched Ida once more, like a passing wing, and she reached for her husband's hand and gave it a quick squeeze to give herself courage as she settled into her place. He glanced at her, surprised and touched, for as the colonel had shrewdly surmised, their relations were unbalanced. Despite Ned's desperate love of her, it was still, with Ida, only a gentle turning of the cheek. There is one thing I must ask of you all. It was the medium speaking, and her voice already sounded oddly drowsy and slow. That is, when I am once in trance, you keep your places until I come out of trance. She blinked and paused, as though collecting thoughts already growing hazy. It may be very dangerous to me for anyone to leave their seat without permission from my control. If he gives it, all right, but not otherwise. I can't explain the conditions, but I am sure you will accept my assurance that this rule is necessary. A subdued murmur of assent rose from the circle, and settling back into the chair, with her head against the padded back, Madame Esperanza closed her eyes and, drawing a long breath, appeared to go to sleep. Playfair smiled faintly to himself as he watched her. Of course, the usual thing. Talk a lot of vague stuff about conditions in order to impose conditions that made it utterly impossible for anybody to investigate the thing. Except that it was odd that she had said that. But here, Dr. Playfair, like the colonel, hustled a certain thought, deliberately and firmly, into the background, and settled down to watch events. Everything was quiet. At first, an excited giggle or two from one of the women broke out. A rustle of movement as somebody changed their position, a subdued whisper. But now, as though hypnotized, everyone sat very still, and dead silence lay like a deep, unfathomable pool over the dimly lit room. In the great chair the medium lay, sunk in sleep, and the red light, falling almost directly upon her, etched curious lights and shadows on her shrunken little face. Watching, Ida Playfair shivered suddenly, thinking the face had changed, gained a curious dignity and power. The lines down each side of the mouth, the deep hollows about the eyes, looked as though carved in stone. The whole face looked, indeed, like the face of some old crusader, reclining man-size in marble upon his tomb. Or the death mask, stern, immovable, of some ancient king long forgotten of mankind. Even as Ida Playfair stared and shivered, clutching her husband's hand, the medium shuddered violently, gave a smothered ejaculation in some unknown tongue, and then, with an indescribable majesty, sat upright in her chair. With eyes still shut, she turned her head slowly from side to side, following the ring of faces, as though she saw, indeed, through those fast-closed lids. And her face was sternly unfamiliar. Mrs. Boulter clutched her husband's arm. It's not the same woman," she whispered agitatedly. "It's a man's face. Oh, Tony, I wish we hadn't started. I'm frightened." A deep voice broke the silence, uttering a few unintelligible words. Although the doctor was still utterly convinced that the whole thing was nothing but a clever fraud, against his will he was impressed. Impressed, at least, into silence. And that change in the face, that voice, heavy, masculine, rich, was certainly amazingly well done. Who'd have thought that shabby little Aunt Jane had it in her? The voice was speaking again, but now in English. "Peace be to this house." The head bowed gravely in the direction of Lady Garrison, sitting upright, clutching the hands of her neighbors, her wholesome pink face flushed with excitement and nervousness. "Peace." The blind eyes went round the circle again, as though seeking something, then paused. "Peace and greetings to all, from the world of spirit. I know what you would have. You would hold talk with those whom you call dead, with those who are on this side, and that is well, when you take care to whom you talk." There was a pause, while the sitters, bewildered, looked at each other. Lady Garrison broke it at last. How do you do?" The lame modern phrase sounded incredibly foolish. We are very glad to see you. And of course you are quite right about what we want to do. But we don't quite understand." "I will explain." The deep voice paused, then continued. "I am what you call the control of this instrument here on earth, and the name I use is Sekhet. On this side, we do not like to allow these instruments, what you call mediums, to be used by anyone who chooses. We try to keep back those whom we do not think should speak to you. Yet, our powers are limited, and if the force is very strong, we must stand aside and permit it to speak. But, in this case, I do not think it would be wise. What do you mean? It was Ned Playfair's voice, brusque and unbelieving, that broke the puzzled silence that had followed on the control's speech. The figure bowed its head. I mean that there is here, amongst other souls who wish to speak, one soul that I would try to keep from speaking. And for that reason, I think it would be wise. He bowed once more, with ineffable grace and courtesy, toward Lady Garrison. To what you call break up the meeting? Release your hands, thus shutting the current off, and I will bring the medium out of trance at once. A chorus of astonished and indignant voices answered him. Give it up? Just when it's getting interesting? What an idea! But why? The chorus rolled round the circle, while Ned Playfair sat back and smiled. Just as he had expected. The woman, seeing from the outset that he was not to be fooled like the others, had tried to frighten him. First through Ida, then directly away from the sitting. And now, finding he was not to be so frightened, she had recourse to this childish expedient. She was prepared to break up the circle, to lose her fee, and disappoint a group of eminently worthwhile people sooner than risk discovery. Now nothing in the world would persuade him to allow the circle to be broken, and he added his sharply cut drawl to the chorus. Surely, Mr. Second, you don't think you can frighten us in that way? I can assure you that we are prepared for any and everything that may happen. But we are not prepared to abandon the sitting. There was a momentary pause. The others looked gratefully at their champion, but Ida Playfair, suddenly white, half rose from her seat. I want to go, she whispered. Her face was curiously strained. Her great eyes ringed like a doe's. I don't know why, but I want to go. The deep voice answered from the center of the circle. That is wise. You may go. But for you others, close the circle in as she leaves, friends, so that the current is broken as little as possible. Without a word, the white-clad figure rose and fled, and as the door closed behind her, the voice resumed. With regard to what you say, my son. The blind eyes seemed to pierce right through the young doctor where he sat. If you insist, all have free will, and if it is the will of all to go on with this sitting, so be it. But I still advise you against it. There was a faint pause. Lady Garrison, more impressed than she cared to admit, glanced uncertainly round the circle. The Bolters looked doubtful. The Todhunters puzzled. The Simons cynically amused. Cecily Fleet and her attendant swains definitely disappointed. Very little would have persuaded the good lady to take the mysterious Second's advice and dissolve the circle altogether. But Ned Playfair's voice rose again, antagonistic now. "I suggest we are rather wasting time, Lady Garrison. I, for one, refuse to be alarmed by vague hints and warnings. We formed this circle for the definite purpose of seeing signs and wonders. And if Madame Esperanza feels that for some reason," the sneer was obvious, "she cannot tonight produce these signs and wonders, then let her say so, plainly and candidly. But if she is not prepared to say so, why then let her carry on." "And we'll take the consequences," suggested Cecily Fleet with a giggle, "if there are any." "And," agreed Playfair suavely, "we'll take the consequences. At least, if there are any consequences, we shall agree not to blame you, Mr. Second." The sternly upright figure in the center of the circle bowed its head resignedly. "So be it. You have, as I said, free will. And if you will insist, against my advice, upon opening this door tonight, then I will do my best to control the soul that already beats upon it, desiring to re-establish contact with the earth he has left. Be still, all. I go to prepare the way." There was a slight convulsion of the body, and the medium drooped and fell back into the chair. In the red light, her face was again the face of a weary, middle-aged little woman, lined and tired. Cecily Fleet, who was sitting on the other side of Ned Playfair, nudged him eagerly as she whispered, "Look, isn't that odd? Her face looked just like a man when that was talking, and now she's herself again. Isn't that queer?" But there was no time to answer, for the medium, muttering rapidly and unintelligibly to herself, was rising upright in her chair. Her face was twisted and distressed, and the voice that came through her lips was hoarse, with a rattle now and then, like the voice of somebody striving, through the stress of furious excitement, to speak clearly and connectedly. A voice entirely and utterly different from the measured, level tones of Sekhet. Suddenly, the hoarseness left it, and it came clear, ringing, a strong, masculine voice. And at the sound of it, Ned Playfair bounded in his chair, his face suddenly chalk white, his eyes blazing. Yet the voice was not addressing him. It seemed to be arguing with someone unseen, so that it sounded for all the world like a human voice arguing with a telephone operator. "Let me get through, will you? Oh, yes, I'll remember. I'll keep steady. At least, I'll do my best, but don't lecture me now, do you hear? I've got to get through. I tell you I must. I know she's there." Then, in a ringing shout that rang through the room like a clarion call, "I want my wife, I say! I want my wife!" The call was so electric, so painful in its intensity, that a loud and startled gasp ran around the circle. Cecily Fleet, her flippancy vanished, gave a pitiful little cry that echoed Mrs. Bolter's, and hot tears pricked behind Lady Garrison's eyes, as in a strangled voice she stammered, "Your wife? I'm afraid... Who is it speaking?" "Neil Ramsay," came the answer instantly. Sharp and clear, and Cecily Fleet, hearing a quick-drawn breath at her shoulder, turned and peered at the man beside her. Odd that Ned Playfair, who, of all people, had been at the start the hardest, the most defiantly skeptical, should be so shaken now. Even in the dusky red glow from the scarlet-draped lamp, one could see how white he was. "Did you know Neil Ramsay?" she whispered. But Playfair shook his head. "No, no," he muttered feverishly. And the entire circle started with amazement and alarm as the voice came again, this time in a furious shout. "Liar! You say you don't know me, Ned Playfair?" With a huge effort, the medium staggered from the chair and, standing planted firmly on her feet, faced the white-faced doctor. Half risen from his chair, Playfair stood shaking, endeavoring to steady himself with one hand upon his chair back, but with the sweat of sheer terror running down his face, while within him two things fought fiercely for mastery. Cynicism, the bitter atheism that refused, even at this moment, to believe that he beheld anything other than a horribly brilliant tour de force of acting, and fear. That dreadful, aching fear that turns a man's bones to water and his soul to a stone that sinks therein. Madly, he snatched at his vanishing self-control and tried to laugh. But all that came was a cracked whisper, a ghastly echo of a laugh. "Of course I remember you now, old fellow. Neil Ramsay. But why?" "You know why I come. You don't need to ask." The little figure in black was menacing now. Frail as a shadow, yet charged with a dreadful, shattering power. "You know why I come, Playfair. To find my wife, of whom you robbed me." A terrified shuddering ran around the circle, and Mrs. Boulter slipped quietly to the ground in a dead faint. But held in the steel grip of sheer, fascinated horror, nobody could either move or speak. Playfair stood as though turned to stone, his eyes fixed on the grim little figure before him, as the voice thundered on. "Of whom you robbed me, Ned Playfair. The wife for whom you murdered me." With a spring like that of a coiled snake, on the last word she was on him, her lean fingers knotted in his throat. Shrieking, hysterical with fear, the women sprang up and scattered as the two fought, swaying and staggering wildly about in the center of the circle, while the men, flinging chairs aside, seized the combatants and tried to force them apart. Then suddenly, in their arms, the woman went limp, and a great voice spoke, it seemed, from over their heads. "Put her down. There, in the chair. I have removed the poor, love-crazed soul who just possessed her. I warned you, Sekhet, but you would not be warned. Yet, retribution is just. Farewell." It ceased, and in silence the shaken group gathered about the prone form of the young doctor, lying just where he had fallen, among a welter of fallen chairs, scattered bags and scarves and fans, stark in the brilliance of the white light from which the shrouding red drapery had been removed. His face was set in a terrible expression of fear and rage, and there were red marks around his throat, where the thin, vicious fingers had clutched. He lay deadly still, and with a sudden fear catching at his heart, Colonel Garrison beckoned Todhunter over to his side. As becomes an explorer, Todhunter had a good working knowledge of medicine. Kneeling, in a dead and awful silence, He opened the prostrate man's shirt, tested his heart, and held a mirror to his lips, then looked up with a grave face. Cecily Fleet, reading the news in his eyes, burst into tears, and a general murmur of horror ran around the room as, soberly, Todhunter rose to his feet. "Dead. Of heart failure, as far as I can judge," he said gravely. "Those marks on the throat are nothing, only superficial. Although the spirit that moved her to attack him was a man, or so it seems, she was only a frail little woman, and it wasn't her attack that killed or even injured him. He died of shock. And if tonight's experience is as genuine as I believe it to be, it's no wonder." "But what is all this about? And who was Ramsay?" breathed the colonel, his healthy red face palpably pale with horror. Todhunter hesitated for a moment. "I don't like to say much," he said, "especially as the man's dead now, and has paid for his sins. But whoever spoke through the woman's mouth spoke what is thought, by many people, to be the sober truth. Ida Playfair was Ida Ramsay, the wife of Neil Ramsay, until a year or two ago, and they adored each other. Playfair met them and fell desperately in love with Ida. But she wouldn't look at him, so Playfair played a waiting game, cultivated Ramsay, who was rather a simple soul, became his doctor as well as his bosom friend. And one summer, about 2 years ago, they went on a fishing expedition together. Upon that expedition, Ramsay was taken ill and died. Playfair said the cause was tinned food that wasn't quite good, and Playfair gave the certificate of death, natural causes, so that was okay for him. And when he came back to London, he made himself so indispensable to poor little Ida, who was completely lost and bewildered without Ramsay, that at last she married him. Though there were not lacking folks who said that Ramsay's convenient death, that left a charming and wealthy wife ready, as it were, to Playfair's hand, was rather too convenient to be convincing. That's the story. And, in view of what has happened tonight, it looks very much as though it were true. The end. Well, what do we think? That was Margery Lawrence's The Man Who Came Back. A little holiday haunt. Maybe don't go murdering people for their spouses. I hope you are all having a wonderful winter and holiday season. I hope that if you have seances at your holiday parties, you have not committed any unavenged murders. Generally a good thing to avoid. As we wrap up the year, thank you again for being here with me. We have another story coming up next week. And then, at the beginning of January, we will be back to our regularly scheduled programming. Happy solstice, happy holidays, and, as always, if you can, this week, this month, this pay period, consider supporting a living author, because they could really use the love. Bye.